Hello, hello.
Hi,
Good
what's up?
evening.
How's it going? Good
All
evening,
good.
guys. My name is Jaiwardhan Singh, aka
And
LVG.
this
This
is
is
Rajwardhan. And we are starting our episode number 4 today.
yes,
We will be speaking about conflict in Eastern Europe and how that has affected the geopolitical currents in the rest of the world over the last few years. We wanted to internationalize the scope of the discussions on our platform. So, here we begin. We will start speaking a little bit about the history of Eastern Europe. So, Jay, why don't you brief us about the ethnicities, histories, conflicts in the last few hundred years?
yeah. So before we go into the history of Eastern Europe, we need to understand what Eastern Europe is. There is not a specific uh, definition for what Eastern Europe is. There are multiple definitions for what Eastern Europe is. There is a political definition and there is a geographic definition, but there is no agreement on both of them either. So we'll just, for our convenience, say that Eastern Europe is everything starting from the Ural Mountains, which is in the Russian side of Europe, and ending in Poland in west, and from north, Baltics, all the way till Balkans, where Greece starts. This is our definition of Eastern Europe. And now, Eastern Europe's dominant ethnic group are the Slavs. Slavs are also the dominant ethnic group in totality of Europe as well, because there are almost 300 million Slavs that dominate the entire European continent. So, to understand who the Slavs were, we need to go back in time. They are also Indo-European steppe people. Their origins are in the Indo-European steppe people. So there was a lot of mixing between different Indo-European tribes, like the Scythians, who are popularly known as Saka in India, and they started populating lands closer to the Baltic and around the Dnieper River. And what we know as the Ukrainians and the Belarusians and the Russians, they are also known as the Eastern Slavic people because they occupy the eastern geographic sphere. Then there are the Western Slavic people, which is the Poles, the Czechs, the Slovaks, and then there are the Southern Slavic people, which are the Croats, Serbs, Slovenes. So Yugoslavia literally means the Southern Slavs in the language. So coming back to my point, around the Dnieper River, which is northern Ukraine, southern Belarus, and western Russia, was the land which was considered to be the early homeland of Slavs, Eastern Slavs. And these areas of Eastern Slavs were very disunited. They were constantly at war. So they went to the Scandinavian Varangian slash Viking tribes and invited one Rurik to come in and unite these tribes and bring some order. Rurik came into these areas and established his first principality, which was succeeded by his kinsman called Oleg the Wise. Oleg the Wise was the first prince of the Kievan Rus. Now, Rus comes from a Nordic word which means to row. Men who row means Rus. Their progeny was this man called Valdemar or Vladimir, who eventually converted to Eastern Orthodox Christianity in order to increase the influence of this little Slavic political entity with the mainstream. And thus begins the history of what we call modern Russia, Ukraine,
Russia.
and Belarus.
And
Yeah.
this is also the namesake of the incumbent Ukrainian president Volodymyr
And
Zelensky, if I'm
yes, and
pronouncing it
yes,
correctly.
yes,
And this is
yes.
Oleg the Wise is the person who laid the stone of
Foundation.
what we call the foundation stone of what we call modern day Kiev, if I'm
Yes,
not to be mistaken. And
yes.
this must
It was
be
already there. It was already there, but as a political unit, to be to have some levels of local domination, it was done under Oleg the Wise, and after Oleg the Wise, his son Rurik. And the reason
Right.
why they have so much Ru in their names is because Rus is actually a word which is common in both Slavic languages and the Varangian languages, which are Germanic in origin, mind you. Vikings were Germanic people, they weren't Slavic. Even though they played
Mhm.
such an important role in the politics of the Slavs, all the way till the Romanovs. Romanovs were also Germanic in nature. So Rus was both present in the Slavic languages and the Germanic languages, and Rus literally means to row. So these Viking tribes came to these lands in the Dnieper while rowing their boats. So that's how you get
Right.
the name Russia. And there is a lot of conflict between the Ukrainians and the Belarusians and the Russians as to who is the original flag bearer of the Rus, because a lot of tribes in these areas used to call themselves the Rus. It was
Right.
quite a variegated and a dynamic ethnic identity.
Right. I will s- bring our focus now back to the conflict and how it has played through over the last few decades or so. And I don't mean the present Russia-Ukraine conflict. I would mean rather the turbulence that has been in and around of Eastern Europe since the late 80s, the 90s. We know that the Balkans were at war within each other. There was the Armenia Azerbaijan issue. Then, more recently, early 2010s, we saw the annexation of Crimea. Take us through the historical context of these issues and what does the breakup of the Soviet Union and after have to do
Yeah.
with how the politics and the conflict in the region has played out?
As we approach the 20th century, uh, there is one thing that is established all of Europe. That is that the Slavs were always considered to be extremely backward people who were still involved in a lot of tribal unity, which basically typified them as a people who weren't willing to modernize or civilize. Whereas the Western European peripheries were witnessing industrial revolution, the Slavs were still considered to be extremely backward. One of the reasons for that was that because of the intertribal rivalry between different Slavic groups, they eventually got divided in disparate religious identities as well. Some Slavs went to the Catholics, some Slavs even became Muslims, some Slavs remained with the Eastern Orthodox periphery, due to which there wasn't exactly a unified Slavic identity of sorts as we see with respect to the Germans or the French. So, due to that, there were a lot of there was a lot of subjugation that these people faced, and because of the subjugation that these people faced, there was a lot of backwardness in these areas. So even under the Ottoman rules, the Slavs faced a lot of oppression, specifically the Slavs who did not convert to Islam. The Slavs also faced oppression under the Habsburg monarchy because they did not convert to Catholicism. And so we have a situation where a lot of these Slavs were considered to be uh, extremely backward, impoverished, and people who were refusing to modernize. Also the fact that these people were on the peripheral areas or on the frontiers between east and west, these people faced a lot of conflict, and they inhabited areas which were not very not very conducive for sustained agriculture and settled living, due to which the raids that were conducted on these areas, even from the Muslims or from the western sides of Europe, these people ended up becoming enslaved and were quite an established part of the slave trade that existed before the transatlantic slave trade even began. And in fact, the word slave actually comes from the ethnic identity Slav. So you can understand why communism became so popular amongst these disparate groups is because they were always subjugated, they were always isolated and alienated by the mainstream political thought process, be it theological, be it the industrial revolution. So
Right.
a
So
time
the
came where
political
these,
elite has
yes,
a tendency to erase and ignore people on the margins, and this is nothing new. But from what you are saying, the Slavic people are one of the communities who understand this the best. So Slavs have
Yes,
been marginalized and pushed to the margins, oppressed by the ruling elites. As a result of which, whenever it is that revolutionary ideas or revolutionary ideas in those days, like Marxism and communism, are introduced, they gain a lot of traction within the Slavic communities. Is that what you're implying?
absolutely, absolutely. In fact, to even bring in some comparison between India and the reason why India so wholeheartedly supported the non-alignment movement, which had Tito in it, and also was on very good terms with the Soviet Union, was because there was this collective this collective disillusionment towards the Anglosphere and the Anglo-Saxon Germanic tribes, which had coincidentally dominated these two areas. Like India was dominated by the British, whereas the Slavs in Russia were dominated by the Varangians, and then later on the Romanovs, who also drew a lot of people from this Germanic Anglosphere that we are referring to. I mean, obviously, I'm generalizing two separate ethnic groups together, but when it comes to typecasting them, these two ethnic groups came from the Western sphere. So that's why there was another way where Indians and Russians and Yugoslavs could see eye to eye, and that was that the Westerners, who were essentially Germanic slash Anglo Saxons, they had all oppressed these people, and they had like a common way of resisting the imperialism that they made them go through for centuries.
Hmm. Right.
I mean, the the king of England was cousins with the last Romanov. In fact, they looked so similar that they were considered to be twins, and
Right.
they were both German in origin. They all came from the German dynasty. In fact,
Hmm.
Mountbatten's original name was Battenberg. It's after the First World War that they changed it to Mountbatten so that the English people stop associating themselves with the Germans.
Right.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. So now we have established ethnic identities, linguistic
Yes.
identities. Let's come back a little bit into more recent history. Let's
Yes.
say somewhat the 2000, the 20th century.
Yes.
Uh, because what is of particular interest to me, that on February 24th, 2022, when the Russian president announced the special military operation in Ukraine, one of the things he wanted to achieve, as he mentioned, was the denazification of Ukraine. Can you please tell us a little bit about why is it that the conservative Russian looks at Ukraine as a Nazi empathizing state? Why
Yes.
would
It
Putin
is.
be why would Putin be driven to war to
Yeah.
denazify Ukraine? Is it
It is.
appropriate terminology? So let's
I
talk about that.
from a Russian perspective, it's a totally appropriate terminology, and I'll tell you why. It's because when the Nazi onslaught was happening towards Ukraine, there was a man called Stepan Bandera who, in essentiality, started a Ukrainian resurgence movement, which talked about a separate Ukrainian identity, which was away from the Russified Ukrainian identity, which was there around the time of the Tsars. Now, Stepan Bandera indulged in a lot of activities which led to a lot of Russian deaths, led to a lot of Jewish deaths, and also led to a lot of Polish deaths. Because Ukrainians were not only resisting the Russians, they were obviously resisting the Poles also, who were considered to be their country cousins, specifically with respect to the linguistic similarities between the Polish language and the Ukrainian language. And of course, because you're living in early 20th, mid 20th century Europe, you will blame something on the Jews. So it was like a collective fascistic movement which was started by Stepan Bandera. And in 2014, when the conflict in Lugansk and Donetsk sparked into all-out warfare between Russian-funded separatists and the Ukrainian military started funding these militia groups, volunteer groups called the Azov Battalion, which is also neo-Nazi in nature, and views Stepan Bandera as a hero. So this is one of the reasons why Putin says the reason why he wants to get rid of Volodymyr Zelensky is because his establishment supports people like Stepan Bandera, and this is the denazification he's talking about.
Right. That is very Interesting. And I think there was something to the extent of some enclaves in Kiev or other parts of Ukraine still being named after
Stepan
fighters who
Bandera.
had, yeah,
Yes.
other people also who may have assisted the Nazis
Yes.
into their onslaught into the USSR, mainland Russia, at the time USSR, of course. And you can acknowledge that perhaps as an element of historical injury that plays on the Russian mindset. So
Absolutely.
I suppose that this is one thing that still carries an element of historical injury specifically for
Absolutely.
the Russians.
Yeah. Another thing is that most of eastern Ukraine, right from Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, etc., all these places were part of the mainland Russian territory, and they were given to Ukraine as a gift. They were like, the Soviet Union is always going to exist. So even if we give it to Ukraine or not, like, it doesn't really matter. So people over there never really accepted the Ukrainian language. They always spoke Russian, and they never really understood the cultural onslaught that the Ukrainians would eventually indulge in after the 2004 Orange Revolution. So that made them extremely insecure.
And
And
this holds
another,
particularly
yeah,
true, I assume, in areas like Crimea and eastern
yes,
Ukraine,
Eastern
which
Ukraine. I
is
meant it in,
where
yeah,
Yeah, which is where you would say that the average citizenry identifies more with the Russian identity. And
yeah,
perhaps that is also a reason why the advance of the Russian military through those areas has been easier. You can
yes,
tell that the military
absolutely,
has struggled in entering the main hinterland of Ukraine, but the pro-Russian areas have always in some ways welcomed Russian troops. That
yes.
is why a significant amount of territory has been gained by Russians.
Yeah, in fact, the present conflict also has another late medieval history angle to it that takes us to the 17th century. The word Ukraine actually comes from the term Kraina. It comes from the word Kraina. Now, Kraina means the frontier. And again, even for the Russians, this entire area beyond the Dnipro River was considered to be the western peripheries and frontiers towards Poland. So these areas were, in essentiality, no man's land, which belonged to a lot of disparate militia, military henchmen who were constantly at war. One of these groups was called the Cossacks. Now, these Cossacks eventually accepted the Eastern Orthodox identity as their main religious identity. And it is very, very controversial in Ukraine as well, because one of these Cossack generals was a guy called Khmelnytsky. This guy, under the rule of the Poles, rebelled against the Poles and established direct communications with the czars of Russia. And that is when Ukraine again came into suzerainty, direct suzerainty of the Russians, and
Right,
became a separate political entity. And this is very,
right.
very controversial in both Russia and in Ukraine.
Could this indicate another reason as to why Poland has had its issues with Russia as well, and why
Yes,
Poland has been very proximate to NATO, one of the earlier members to join the European Union. Poland is a very active member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So it's interesting to note how a lot of modern day policy priorities are rooted in legitimate historical concerns.
absolutely. In fact, Poland is considered to be the biggest historic rival of Russia. Poles used to enter Russian territory. They've sacked Moscow so many times, and the territory that we see as Western Ukraine today, places like Lvov, which is known as Lviv to the Russians, they were all Polish dominated till like the 17th and the 18th century. It's only after the Khmelnytsky revolution or revolt that a lot of Poles from these areas were kicked out. A lot of Jews from these areas were kicked out. And so it's like, it's like how Indians these days, we look at Pakistan or Bangladesh, we say that, oh, these places had a lot of Hindus, and because of some mistakes that were made in recent histories, a lot of Hindus lost their political capital in these areas and they moved back to India. But the cultural connect with these areas are always there, and we always view these areas as that something which was historically ours. So that's how the Poles view Western Ukraine.
Right. It's interesting to note where a lot of the grudges nations and nation states hold against each other come from. Having established all of this, let's speak a little bit about the present. We have a situation where the Russian army is trying to advance. The Ukrainians have been restricting their advance for a long time. From what I understand from the reporting in the last few weeks, is that the Russians have gained a lot of territory. They've made advances. The
Yes,
Ukrainian military is stretching thin in terms of manpower, resources, and an overall sense of fatigue is setting in. The
yes.
war is already 2 years long, and not much has been achieved. So how much longer do you think this will last? What do you think are the developments that should be made? And what are the recommendations we can give to any peacemaker, hypothetically?
So it's a war of attrition. It is not a war of how much territory you can capture in one blitzkrieg. If that's how it's pronounced, it's a war of attrition where what will happen in essentiality is that in conventional senses, both the armies would be pointing their guns at each other, and in those confrontations, they will lose as many men, as many resources as possible till the last man is standing. So
Hmm.
Russia has that capacity, but Ukraine doesn't. And even the Western countries, no matter how much they try to tell the world that we're giving this gun, this anti-tank missile, they just don't have enough resources to stop the Russians from fighting this war forever.
Hmm.
So this will go on for another 4 or 5 years until there is some stalemate that's achieved, some compromise that's achieved. We could have achieved this compromise sometime in 2022 itself, but the peace talks were stalled because Zelensky was given the confidence by the West that you keep on fighting, we'll give you as much
Yeah,
weapons as
I
you want.
don't think anybody has been particularly interested in establishing peace
No, no, no,
because
no, absolutely not.
uh, Vladimir Putin and his men have been very interested in raiding and very confident that once they enter the Ukrainian hinterland, Kiev will fall in a couple of days. And Western powers such as NATO and their allies have never taken serious attempts to establish negotiations or peace. Their
Yes, they
approach
don't
has
want it to
always
happen.
been, yeah, their approach has always been that we will supply Ukrainians with all types of weapons till they need us to. So, where
Emmanuel
is the
Macron,
average? Yeah, go on.
sorry to interject. I'm so sorry to
No, no, no,
interject. But
please go on.
Emmanuel Macron recently said that we need to put NATO troops on the frontier. I mean, what is going on? I mean, I know there is. We'll come to Yugoslavia after this, but I feel the West also needs to come to the table and try to understand that people are not going to abide by their rules forever. There is going to be a time where people are going to push back, and after the disintegration of Soviet Union, you need to understand things from the Russian perspective as well. The reason why Vladimir Putin calls it the biggest catastrophe in Russian history is because suddenly there were millions of Russian citizens, almost 25 million to be precise, who were rendered stateless. They were in different Soviet republics thinking we were part of one country. Suddenly they were made refugees. Now we don't take into consideration this type of suffering that it brought to the Soviets, to the Russians, not just the Russians, to other disparate ethnic groups. So you will see uh, the amount of social degradation that has taken place. The instances of domestic violence have increased. There are no jobs. Economy is non-existent. Creation of oligarchies because all the communist bureaucrats who used to control the businesses, state-run businesses, eventually became the in essentiality the owners of extremely important resources. So it has caused so much suffering in that area, and there has to be some accountability that needs to be taken from the Western world, where they need to acknowledge that their direct political or indirect political interference has caused a lot of problems, and there will be some levels of pushback. And this is what we see in the form of Putin.
Yeah, I mean, in summary, you've summarized up the whole present scenario with historical context very well. I think what needs to be understood is that eventually, no matter how many Russian troops advance into Ukraine, no matter how much Western aid and ammunition Ukraine receives, a permanent solution will only come through dialogue. So, any party and international organization that claims to be a peacemaker will have to make genuine, credible efforts to establish dialogue. At some point, you mentioned the Yugoslavian wars. So
Yes.
we all know that in Eastern Europe in the 90s, there was the breaking up of Yugoslavia. It was followed by the Bosnian War, the Kosovo War. So where do you think international organizations underperformed on that regard?
Oh,
And where do you
they,
think we can do
yeah.
to never, not let that happen again? What do you think we can do?
Not only did they underperformed, I think they over interfered. I'll tell you why. In 1980 or 81, I think that's when Marshal Tito, Josip Broz Tito died. And Tito, what he did was he used to rule with an iron fist over the seven Yugoslav states. Now, the seven Yugoslav states are, we'll start from the west: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia. Now, the reason why I said seven was because the seventh Yugoslav state was carved out from the autonomous Kosovo region, which was under the Serbian control in itself. That's why I said seven. In original, there were like six states to be precise. So Tito used to rule these areas with a lot of might. And before Tito, the during the time of the Nazis, there was an entire group which was dominated by the far right extremists called the Ustaše, who were Nazi collaborators, and they were ethnically Croats. What they did was that they started an entire campaign of mass murder and rape against the Serbs, against the Jews, and against the Gypsies slash Romanis of that area, which led to a lot of deaths, like thousands of deaths. To be precise, around 500,000 people died in that Croatian genocidal campaign, which is never acknowledged by the West. And in fact, the Croatian atrocities were so bad against the Serbs that even the Nazis were surprised to see the barbaric nature of the crimes that were committed. And now, of course, in response to that, you had the Chetniks, who were the Serbian right-wing fascists, who also committed similar atrocities, but also obviously not at the level of the Croatians. But they also killed a lot of Bosnian Muslims and Croats in the pushback against the Nazi collaborators. Now you need to understand that because the Croat Ustaches, they used to view the Bosnian Muslims as brotherly in nature. They said that fine, these guys are Aryans according to the Nazi definition, but the Serbs aren't, because the Serbs had, like, intermingled with the Romanis. This is the reason that they gave to kill more Serbs. So the Serbs became extremely disgruntled against the Bosnians. Not to mention, when the Ottomans were ruling over this area, the Bosnians who converted to Islam, they became the ruling elite of the Islamic Bosnian Emirate, and they subjugated a lot of Christian subjects, specifically the Serbs in that area. So not only there is medieval angst against this group, there is also modern angst against this group because of the Nazi collaboration that took place. And of course, the Chetniks had their revenge. They ended up killing a lot of people. And once Tito died, these ethnic fault lines started coming up again. Now, you remember the word Kraina that I had mentioned, telling you about the definition of Ukraine. There is a Serbian Kraina as well, because Slavic languages, right? Serbian frontier or hinterland. Because the Serbs were the dominant group of this area, the Serbs had their little exclaves in places like Bosnia, Croatia, and once again Yugoslavia disintegrates, just as how Russians found themselves to be stateless, the Serbs also found themselves to be stateless in these disparate, you know,
In other
uh,
parts of
and
erstwhile
other parts of
Yugoslavia, which
Yugoslavia.
weren't as essentially areas where
Exactly.
they were not really considered indigenous to.
Exactly. Now, in order to go against that, the Serbs first launched their attacks against Croatian targets in 1991, and then eventually the war manifested itself in the grotesque Bosnian War. Again, not trying to justify the war crimes that were conducted by the Serb groups, but History is right in front of you. There is a reason to every reaction that you see in the present time. And what the West did was that they squarely put the blame on the Serbs for the problems. Of course, the Serbs were responsible for most of the massacres, but what the West was doing was that it was channeling funds and weaponry to the Croats. It was instigating the Muslims of Bosnia, and then the Bosnians were getting a lot of support from the Islamic world as well. So essentially isolating the Serbs. Now, Serbs and Russians also have one similarity, mind you. They are both Orthodox Christians. So that's where the common connection from the
Right.
Russians and the Serbs came in. So
The,
only people who supported the Serbs this time was the Russians. And in that conflict, a lot of people died. And the only way that the West thought that it could interfere was by starting a so called quote unquote NATO bombing campaign. Now, this was a blatant violation of international law because, according to NATO rules, NATO can only indulge in military campaign if a NATO ally or country is attacked. There was no attack against a NATO country. So, who gives them the right to bomb a sovereign country?
preemptively taking the initiative to start a bombing campaign.
Exactly.
When the NATO charter is framed in ways that if one NATO member is attacked, you form the alliance and take retaliatory measures. But the bombing campaign was not retaliatory.
Absolutely.
From the US perspective or the NATO perspective, they might have said that it's preemptive, but
Yeah.
there can be significant amount of criticism and international law person could attribute to the NATO
Yes, absolutely. A lot of people do that.
campaigns in that, from the sense that I'm getting, the Yugoslavian wars, or maybe the Bosnian war, the Serbian war, the Croats, everything in itself is a separate episode. So these discussions can be very
Yeah.
prolonged if we go down to the details. So let's
So
get an
to
overall view of how peace was established in the Yugoslavian countries,
I
and
was coming
maybe
to
some
that.
lessons that we can carry forward into the present Russia-Ukraine conflict.
So to end the Yugoslav wars, the the final peace accord happened in Dayton, in Ohio. Mind you, Dayton in Ohio. Ohio is quite an
The
important
US
meme
state of
city these days.
Ohio.
The U.S. state
Yeah,
of
it's
Ohio.
memed
It's
a
quite a
lot.
meme. It's a memed a lot, and they literally
They
took.
say Ohio. They say Ohio is the Bihar of US.
Yeah, yeah. It's Oh wow. Like we can do an episode about the politics of Bihar as well. That's for
Yeah.
later. Yeah. So in Dayton, Ohio, they had the final peace process where they decided to establish three political entities in Bosnia-Herzegovina. One was Bosnia-Herzegovina, Bosnia being the Muslim-dominated territory, Herzegovina being the Croat-dominated entity, and Republika Srpska, which was the Serb-dominated entity. Now, in between the Serb-dominated entity, there's this little place called Brochko, which was declared as the neutral zone, which belonged to all the three entities. And this was done by the West, by the Americans specifically, to ensure that there is not a united Serbian political unit. So, because of Bruchko, the Serbian Republika Srpska is divided into two. So, even after the peace process, they were a bit unfair to the Serbs. Now, after this, I'll take you to Kosovo, right? Is dominated by the Albanians. Albanians are not Slavic people. They are a totally separate Indo-European group, and they are isolate Indo-European group, just like the Greeks. Albanians were settled in the Kosovo region by the Ottomans. Now, Kosovo to the Serbs is what Kashmir is to us. Very, very important for their religious identity. Very, very important for Serbian Christianity. For us, Kashmir has a lot of Hindu significance as well. So once the Ottomans captured that area, to humiliate the Serbs, they started settling in Albanians in these areas. And once the Albanian domination was established, eventually Kosovo remained a place which had like a little small Serbian exclave, specifically in the northern region. After the it was in the 80s itself, during the time of Slobodan Milosevic, who's considered to be the first Serbian nationalist to have to have indulged in nationalistic ranting in ex-Yugoslavian states. Slobodan Milosevic, through his policies, took away the autonomy of Kosovo, and finally in 1999, it all came to loggerheads. Mid-level insurgency was raged, and again, a lot of human rights violations were conducted, specifically by the Serbs, because them having, like, most of the military capabilities. And finally, again, on the pretext of avoiding another Bosnian type of genocide, the Western world this time bombed mainland Serbia. And in that bombing campaign, again, they killed a lot of civilians. In fact, one of the very interesting things that you need to see is that they bombed the Chinese embassy as well, in which two Chinese journalists were killed. Now, according to the Western sources, those Chinese journalists were intelligence members of the Chinese Communist Party, and they were helping local Serbian warlords to escape certain deaths.
The
So,
the profession of a journalist is
yeah,
so worthy of so much praise, and a lot of the information that we've gathered, that is
exactly.
recorded history, that allows us to discuss a lot of this, was probably recorded and published by journalists from
Yes, yes,
so many different countries, Bosnia, Kosovo, the whole Yugoslavian region, the erstwhile Soviet Union. And as we speak, conflicts in Russia, conflicts in Israel and Gaza, the number of journalists who have lost their lives and continue to lose their
yes.
lives as non-combatants is extremely unfortunate,
Staggering.
and it's a very high number, and
Yes,
it's disturbing.
it is. It is. Now, to should we take the discussion to what were the Soviet policies which led to eventual disintegration?
I believe that that will be very long. So
So, should we just conclude it now?
we can conclude the first part, and
Okay. Yeah.
we can continue the series, because we cannot
Yeah.
put all of Europe's
Obviously.
economic policy and the
Yeah.
conflict in one episode. But
Okay.
this is turning out to be an interesting series. We can
Yes.
make part twos where we can
Part two. Yeah.
focus once of the first part, like the second part can just be about the Yugoslavian conflict. Another one where we can just discuss the fall of Soviet Union,
Yeah.
and forward, I also intend to discuss NATO expansion, and those issues can become
Yeah.
episodes
I
of their
think I
own.
think we were able to
So,
establish a very good linkage between Soviet Union and
yes,
Yugoslavia. Next time we can talk about the non-alignment movement, the relationship between Nehru and Tito. We
uh,
can come into the details of that as well.
we can speak of the
Mm.
Indian relations with all of these nations as well.
Yes.
So, I
Yes.
think there's a lot to do. There's a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
So good to start this interesting series,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
It's
I
pretty
think
good. It's a good
we can
conversation we
conclude.
had.
Yeah, I had a
Yeah.
good time. Thanks for joining in, Jay.
Born in Ohio, swag in Ohio.
That's cue for me to leave.
Yeah.
All
Sure,
right.
bro.
Thanks
I'll
for
see you in
joining
Delhi,
in.
man. I'll see you in
Yeah,
Delhi.
yeah.
Bye. Good
See you
night.
soon. Bye.